Good evening, everyone. Sorry for the wait there. This evening, this is really just going to be a talk with lots of pictures of nice moths in nice places. I've called it Adventures of a Moth Recorder in Scotland. I suspect it's pretty much the adventures of moth recorders everywhere. But of course, in Scotland, we're very lucky that we've got lots of wonderful landscapes, lots of beautiful places to explore. Although that said, some of my sort of more exciting finds have been found in some of the less glamorous corners of the country. So I'm just picked a sort of small selection of adventures to share. It was quite hard to know which to choose and which to leave out. But I'll start in East Lothian. So I live in East Lothian in North Berwick, which is the county just to the east of Edinburgh. And I've been recording moths for, well, sort of seriously, obsessively, whatever you want to call it, maybe 10 years, something like that. So not that long. Long interest in natural history, but it's only really, moths have only really come to the fore in the last 10 years or so. So I start with my garden. That is where I started moth recording, although I very quickly moved out of my garden. So I do have a garden, and I live on the coast, which is quite nice, but it is on a hill by the coast, so it gets very windy, which isn't good for moth trapping, for light trapping. And I'm surrounded by very intensive farmland, which again isn't so good for moths. So I do find that I get a lot more variety and numbers if I go elsewhere. That said, I have some nice things in my garden. You know, even the common regular moths are good to see. So we've got white ermine and brimstone moth, which are both really numerous and common and regular. And then just occasionally something a little bit more unusual turns up for me anyway. So there's a lovely scorched wing there, which has to be one of the most amazing wing markings of any moth in the UK. Of course, because I live on the coast in southeast Scotland, it's a good place for migrants. So although I moan about my garden being rubbish, I do get some exciting moths as well. So here, last year was quite a good year for migrants. I got 5 convolvulus fork moths in one trap, which is really exciting. So it's a moth that I get reasonably often. Like most years I'll see 1, but 5 in a trap is amazing. And it was made even better by there's my 3 almost grown up children, and they were all at home at the time, so they got to share. And you know, these poor children who've grown up with a slightly crazy mother dragging them around the place, and they've spent years trying very hard not to be interested, but look, they look quite engaged in the moths there. Perhaps more excitingly, so last year's rash of migrant moths were these 2. These were both new moths for me. Delicate was a new moth for East Lothian. So I think I had a look at the map before I came on this evening, and it does seem to be turning up increasingly in Scotland, but it's still really unusual, the delicate. And small mottled willow, again, I think that was new for East Lothian last year, but it turned up in a lot of places, so quite a lot of people enjoyed that moth, and I got quite a few in several different places. So there is the excitement of migrants by living on the East Coast. However, most of my time is spent out and about, largely in East Lothian, because that's where I live, with mobile traps. So I've got traps, most of them are homemade, that run off batteries, and I carry them over hill and dale to see what I can find. So East Lothian's got quite a mixture of habitats. We've got the Lammermuir Hills to the south, which are the left-hand 2 pictures there, which have got some really nice bits and pieces, but a lot of sort of grouse trashed moorland as well. And we've got some nice bits of coast, the other 2 bottom pictures, some salt marsh, sand dunes, but again, quite sandwiched in with farmland and caravan parks and golf courses, a lot of golf courses in East Lothian. And then in the middle, that sort of top middle picture there, you can see the big arable fields, but we have a few rocky outcrops like Arthur Seat in Edinburgh. There's North Berwick Law and Traprain Law, these old volcanic plugs, which have got some interesting botany, flowers, and some quite lovely moths as well. So those are the sorts of place that I spend as much time as I can. And here are some of the moths. So this is actually a slide from a talk that I gave to a non-mothing audience to show them the moth megafauna of East Lothian. I'm missing, what am I missing? Goat moth and leopard moth, probably more. But as you can see, we've got some really quite striking moths, and some of them are quite unusual in a Scottish sense. So dog's tooth isn't very common. It turns up on some of the salt marshes here. Shark doesn't turn up that often either. Amazing moth. That one actually came into my garden once, which was nice. Okay, so I'm now going to sort of go around to various different places in Scotland, starting with my local patch, which is called Binningwood. So this is a few miles away from where I live, and this is where I now do probably most of my moth recording. Work is getting a little bit in the way of life at the moment, so I don't have as much time as I'd like, but having a place that's quite close to home and a woodland as well, so the sort of the wind and things like that are less important for sticking a light trap out. And it's a place that I've trapped since I started 10 years ago or something. One of the advantages then, so when I started moth trapping, it was when the moth atlas was the sort of final dates for getting dots into the moth atlas, and this particular wood has 4 10-kilometre squares sort of fall within it, so it's a good place for square bashing if that's what you like doing. But as I've trapped off more and more, you get more and more good things, and it's had an awful lot of East Lothian firths as a result, quite possibly because I trap there a lot. And here are some of them. So peacock moth, what a beautiful moth. There's only been one record in East Lothian, and that's it, although it's very numerous further north, and I think further south as well. There seems to be a sort of gap of records where I am, so that was nice to see. I don't know what's become of it, why I got one, whether there's a small population somewhere. Large twin spot carpet, that's a very unusual moth in Scotland. For a long time, Binningwood was the only place you could find it. It was found in Fife in 2023, so it is slowly spreading perhaps, but not a widespread moth at all. And then the other two, small yellow wave, first turned up in East Lothian in Binningwood, but now it's found in most woodland habitats. It's really quite regular. And clay triple lines is quite interesting. So this is a species that likes beech, a lot of beech in Binningwood. And I think for a long time it was only found in Dumfries and Galloway, the sort of far southwest of Scotland. And then suddenly it jumped over to Binningwood. And in 2022, maybe 2023. And I get 2 generations there now, and it's turned up in all 4 of the squares within Binningwood, and it's started to turn up in a few other counties now in southern Scotland as well. So this seems to be spreading quite rapidly. So yeah, anyone in Scotland in the audience, go get trapping in beech woodlands, because it's not a place that we often sort of choose to trap. It's not a kind of considered a prime habitat really for moths up here. And then I can't see my slides coming, so I forget what I've put next. I almost forgot. Perhaps the star of Binningwood catches in recent years is the big blue underwing, Clifden Nonpareil. So this turned up quite by surprise. I wasn't expecting it at all. And was new for East Lothian in 2023 in September. And I caught one, and that was very exciting. And they are, of course, known from Scotland as migrants and have been for many years. But then I went and caught another 2, I think it was, a week later in Binningwood in the same place. And then Mark Hubert, who's my county moth recorder and will appear in a few of these stories actually, came over to moth trap, and we caught some more. And over the period of about a month, we caught between us 7 or 8 individuals, all in this standard poplar, all different, so you can tell by their wing markings that they're different, males and females. And we were, it's almost certain that it's a breeding population here, which should be exciting because that's the first known breeding, well, it's not known, first presumed breeding in Scotland. And last year, 2024, we caught another 5 there in the same place. So I think they must be breeding. I have tried to look on wind-blown branches for eggs, which is probably slightly futile, but I have tried and I haven't found any. But that would be a bit of a good find. And that's Mark Hubert, my county moth recorder and friend, and me, looking very pleased with ourselves next to a slightly blurry Clifden Nonpareil. So amazing moth. I also had red underwing there for the first time, this 2024. So now we're going to scoot over to the opposite side of East Lothian, and the story behind this is to make use of your local patch. This is making good use of a daily commute. So I now work just south of Edinburgh, and if I'm feeling generous with the definition of diversion, this is sort of on the way to work or on the way back. This is a Scottish Wildlife Trust reserve, just off the A68, so just behind me from this photograph, really, really busy main route south. But if you go down into that valley, you can't hear the road, maybe the wind farm if it's windy. And after a day in an office staring at a screen or whatever, you can come here, you can lie in the grass, a little bit of pool there for a little bit of a swim. You can just about see one of my light traps, that white square. But perhaps, we often think for moth recorders, and it's all about light trapping, but one of the sort of pleasures of any insect hunting really is going around during the day, looking for species, trying to take photographs of them, watching them, just seeing them go about their daily lives. And this doesn't have to be rare species, just watching insects, really, it's good. And so here's some of the sort of more common species. We've got latticed heath and mother Shipton, lovely moths, particularly like the mother Shipton with her or his profile of a witch in the wings. And then we've got, of course, this nature reserve is well known by the butterfly fraternity. And of course, butterflies are really just a fancy type of moth, or a non-fancy type of moth, maybe, I'm not sure. So there's northern brown argus and small purple fritillary and green hair streak, and lots of lovely moths there, butterflies there. And that does actually bring out the butterfly hunters. So I very, very rarely see anybody in this nature reserve, but when I do, it's someone with a big long lens looking for butterflies. And so it is visited by naturalists. It's quite good for plants as well, so it's visited by botanists. There are people looking specifically for wildlife. But even so, year before last, I found a new moth to East Lothian there, this scarce violet beauty, with apologies to anyone who dislikes the new English names for all these micros, Pancalia shortsiella. And this was new, yes, for East Lothian. Lovely little moth, tiny, but those silvery sort of blobs on its wings are just amazing. I've rotated the photograph, it's a little bit irritating, so sorry about that. But it just goes to show that even in places where naturalists are going, people are actually looking for small things in the grass and so on. There's still things to be found. There's still lots that doesn't get recorded. Right, now we're moving to the middle of Scotland. So this is Perthshire, Highland Perthshire, near Blair Atoll. A sort of standard bit of Scottish hillside, really. And a few years ago, for a few years, I had work for the UK Pollinator monitoring scheme, which essentially has kilometre squares across the UK where they're doing long-term monitoring for pollinators. And these kilometre squares have been randomly picked. They're not chosen to be particularly good for wildlife necessarily, not particularly good pollinator hotspots. It's meant to be a sort of general sample of the UK, which means that you've got people going to monitor pollinators in places that perhaps they wouldn't otherwise go. And for me, with my keen interest in insects and in particular moths, it meant that I was forced, that's probably not the right word, but to spend a day 4 times a year in each one of these 1 kilometre squares that I was allocated. And this is one of the nice ones, actually. So I had a whole day in the sunshine, because you can only do pollinator surveys when it's good weather, just basically to wander around and bug hunt. It was bliss. I miss it now I'm not here. Now I'm not doing it. So this is, I think, probably May or June, and you can see the yellow plant in the foreground, which is Petty Whin. And some of the keen mothers in the room might know what I might have been looking for on Petty Whin. So there's this little Coleophora, the Coleophora genisti, Petty Whin case bearer, probably. And you can see those little brown cases there made of the leaves. So that was a new record for the area. And it's possibly quite a widely distributed moth, but how many people bother to look at petty windflowers at the right time of year? You also notice that the hillside here is quite rocky, and later in the year, so in a later survey in July, I spent a lot of time wandering the hillside looking at eyebright flowers, because I was after a particular moth that I had in my mind, and it was the heath rivulet. So I spent all day searching futilely, pointlessly, for this moth amongst eyebright on this rocky hillside. It just looked perfect. And then as I was walking back along the main track back to my car, of course, that's when I saw the moth. And one there, it was laying eggs on the eyebright plant. So that was nice. That was a new 10K record, and actually a new record. I think the previous one from the area may have been Buchanan White or something like that in 1860. I can't remember, but anyway, it was quite a good find. And then I went on in another pollinator square to find them in Sutherland, which is a new county record. And I think I've long searched for this moth, and it's been seen in East Lothian 100 years ago, and I've spent a lot of time looking for it here. And I spent a lot of time trying to re-find it in the pollinator monitoring squares that I'd seen these ones in, and haven't seen it again since. So, it is very much being in the right place at the right time. Presumably it has quite a short flight period. If it's out and about by day, the weather conditions need to be good, which is quite a rare thing on a sort of moorland habitat. So I think the lesson there is if first you don't succeed, just keep trying. So now we're going all the way up to the very north coast of Scotland, between Tongue and Betty Hill, Sutherland, if anyone knows that. So this is, again, another site where I was doing pollinator monitoring. And this is really close to the North Coast 500 route, which is very, very popular, which means that in the summer, at short notice, and you have to do pollinator surveys at short notice when the weather's good, it's really hard to find any accommodation, and you certainly wouldn't find any that you could afford. So I camped, which fortunately I really like doing. A few days away from home in the middle of some heather moorland, far north of Scotland. Not much more you could want in life, really. And of course, it's rude to do any camping without moth trapping. So I set a few traps here, and I actually came here a few times because I was back doing these pollinator surveys. And so here's some of the moths of that habitat. Scotch annulet, that was a new moth for me. I'm quite a fan of the sort of grey and brown geometry type moths. I think they're probably my favourite varieties. So it looks quite plain in that picture, but it's just beautiful and so well camouflaged against the grey rocks. And then goldenrod brindle and neglected rustic are both species that we do get in East Lothian. But the goldenrod brindle in particular, there are loads of them in every trap. And what a cool looking moth, just like a bit of twig. That was nice. But the other lovely thing about going to completely new places is you might see moths that you're familiar with, but they often look completely different. And we've got mottled beauty here, which is a really common moth in Binningwood, amongst other places. And lesser yellow underwing, again, a very common moth wherever you go, really. But up here in the north of Scotland, and in fact across much of the Highlands, you get these really lovely forms. So I couldn't find a photograph, but some of the mottled beauties have a really dark band through their wings, completely different from the ones I get locally. And again, lesser yellow underwing, particularly the dark form, and that one's got quite a reddish tinge. It's just beautiful. And again, I wouldn't get one looking like that at home. So it's a common moth. And of course, when you're first starting out moth recording, it can be really frustrating because why is that not a different moth? It looks so different. But that is, again, one of the lovely things about moths, is the sort of varieties within species that you get. And that was to remind me to say that, just in case you're all jealous of spending lots of time in beautiful places in the north coast of Scotland in summer, there are midges, and they are very irritating. Sifter And the other thing you might notice those bags under my eyes. There's not much dark, there's not much nighttime in Scotland in the summer. So not much sleep, not good for beauty sleep at all, but we still go back year after year doing it. Now then, moths in surprising places. So this is a Clearfell site in the middle of Scotland near Loch Tummel. And I now work at Forest Research, and I managed, luckily really, because I haven't done fieldwork like this now for a few years, to have a small project which was looking at invertebrates in Clearfell sites in Scotland, or in this area. And it is, of course, a very sort of well-known area for moths. So there are some, this is a good place generally for moths. The Blackwood of Rannoch is a quite well-known place. But it's also a lot of commercial forestry plantation, which is managed with these large Clearfell cycles. And so you get this kind of apocalyptic landscape where you just think nothing could live there. And I had these little actinic traps sort of right in the middle of these Clearfell sites, just to see what I could get. And I was really amazed at the variety of species that were there. So some really unusual moths, cousin German silvery arches, northern arches, perhaps that's a more widespread moth in Scotland, but only ever get one or maybe two at a time. I was getting 10, 12 in those, each of those little traps in some of these Clearfell sites. So really high numbers. And I think it just sort of illustrates first that, that it's always dangerous to sort of make assumptions about a place. Sometimes moths turn up in places that you wouldn't expect them to. And also that before we sort of dismiss our farmland and our forests and things, they can have habitat for nice moths, good species, and we just need to try and make sure that we can manage that and manage the habitats appropriately. Of course, once the trees are all cut down and the young birch and blaeberry and things regenerate, this is what some of these species like the cousin German and the silvery arches. So these sites where you clear bits of forest can be good for species. Now, so I've talked a lot about new moths for East Lothian, new moths for this county and that county and the other, and that's all very exciting. But it's also really nice to rediscover a moth that was once somewhere a long time ago and hasn't been seen for ages. And this is the case with this moth, another lovely moth, the mallow. So this was once, we're back now in East Lothian, this was once widespread across the south of Scotland 100 years or so ago, and then records gradually declined. And in the moth atlas, it says it's presumed extinct in Scotland. So it was thought that it hadn't been seen for such a long time, 50 years or something like that, that it thought that it was probably had gone extinct, sort of shrunk further south. And I think there's been an overall decline across the UK. And then one turned up in one of my moth traps in Binning Wood, of all places. So that was quite exciting. But just having one moth in one trap in 1 year doesn't mean an awful lot. It could have flown in from much further afield, been wafted up from Northumberland or something. So really needed to find more, or even better, look for caterpillars. So this little plant in the road verge here in the foreground is common mallow, Malva sylvestris, which is one of the food plants of the mallow moth. And this was actually in that, everyone goes on about COVID years, but this is June 2020, and the lockdown had just finished, or one of the lockdowns had just finished, and I was doing quite a lot of cycling around my local area, including cycling with moth traps to Binning Wood. I thought I'm going to see if I can do light trapping by bicycle. I only did that once. But I was cycling back from Binning Wood and had been with a friend looking for flies, actually another entomologist friend, and we had been talking about mallow moth. And I saw this plant as I was cycling past, and the connection was made in my brain. I suspect it quite often isn't made, but on this occasion I did notice the food plant and did make the connection with the moth. And it is June, early June, right time of year for the caterpillars. I came back at night, and this is about 11 o'clock at night, because that's when it gets dark in June, and found a caterpillar. very exciting. I sent out, I don't anyone know who knows Roy Leverton, I sent him a photograph of this caterpillar at about midnight, having got back home. And, you know, about midnight, he sent me a reply saying, yeah, that's a mallow. So that was exciting. And then that launched this, another one of my mini projects called Mission Mallow, where I was trying to find lots of mallow plants and then go and look for caterpillars. And so I'd go around by day looking for the food plant. And this is rather a nice road verge with it just outside East Linton. And you can look for caterpillars by day. You can rummage around in the litter, so they feed at night and then hide down in the litter during the day. And you can search the litter for caterpillars by day, but it's quite hard to find them. Quite often road verges and car parks and places where common mallow grows are not the sorts of places that you really want to be rummaging in the litter either. So much better to go back at night, and then the caterpillars are feeding openly on. This is just a page taken from Roy and Mark's recent moth book, which I'm going to plug at the end of this talk. But this is the entry for mallow. Nice to see my photographs have made it in there. And also you can see from the map, so the dots with a black dot in the middle are recent records, and the other ones are all the old historic records. The colour is a representation of how many records there are from that 10k square. And so you can see that around this bit of East Lothian, I've filled in 3 new 10k squares for the moth. And we also went and found it on in Leith, in the docks near of Edinburgh. And lots of people, so I had this Mission Mallow project where I was asking people to send me records of, or to go and look for mallow plants and then go and look for caterpillars. And I got lots of records of mallow. And it doesn't have to be common mallow, there are the other mallow species, and hollyhock as well as a garden plant that this moth uses. Lots of record of plants. Nobody wanted to go and look for caterpillars after dark. I got no records, no, not even any attempts as far as I know. So I've got plenty of food plants to go and check after dark when I get round to it. But I'm sure they must be along the Tweed, no doubt, in Dumfries and Galloway, Fife. I'm sure there's more mallows to be found in Scotland. I just need to go looking at the right time in the right place. Talking of which, going to the right place at the right time, this is another good moth to target specifically. This is the Rannoch brindled beauty. So in the UK, this is only found in Scotland. And I think our Scottish populations are of significance on a European scale. So it is found in Europe, but the Scottish populations are quite important. This is the Angus Glens, so that's north of Dundee. And the Rannoch brindled beauty was recorded for the first time here 4 years ago, something like that. And since then there's loads been found around here. So again, it's just been overlooked for a long, long time. So this is the male, and they sit on fence posts like this, and are quite easy to spot. This is the female, who doesn't look anything like a moth. So she doesn't have wings, and she crawls out of her pupa in late April and then crawls up as high as she can get. That could be up a big clump of heather or up a fence post of a tree or something, to broadcast her pheromones so that the male can find her, fly in and find her, and they mate. And then that picture on the right there, you can see she's egg laying into a crack or crevice in that fence post. And they're quite easy to spot on fence posts particularly. And so this is what one does in late April in the moorlands of Scotland. So this is Mark Hubert again in Glen Prosen, looking on fence posts for Rannoch brindled beauty. And we found lots just doing this. And again, on the left there, you can see a map from the book. The dark coloured, the circles with black blobs in the middle are recent records. And I think almost all of them have been from people methodically walking fence lines in suitable habitat, looking for the moths. The dot there on Marlight is Barry Prater's. I think he had one or some in a light trap, but as far as I know, that's the only light trap record. And so, should you find yourself coming to Scotland in late April, early May, that sort of time, don't bother with the Munros. You need to get yourself a map, look at a satellite map as well to look at the habitat. You want heathery moorland. They like bog myrtle as well, although the sites we find it in the Angus Glens doesn't have bog myrtle, but perhaps slightly damper moorland. And then you just have to plan your route along fence lines and see what you can find. And I'm sure there's plenty more sites to be found where this moth occurs. And yeah, it's quite fun. So this I kind of see Rannoch brindled beauty as kicking off my mothing year in April. And now, last but not least, I'm going to talk a little bit about the herald. So some of you might have heard of the hibernating herald project that we run out of Scotland, which was started in 2016-17, that winter. And it's mostly about this moth, the herald, which overwinters as an adult. So at the moment, it's at this time of year, it's an adult hiding away. They're not active during the winter. They hide away in dark places, dark sheltered places. And when those dark sheltered places are big enough for a person with a torch to get into, you can find them and record them. And it's turned out to be a really good way to find out more about this moth. And in some sites, when they're in large numbers, 50, 100 moths, it is just extraordinary, the spectacle. It's a really striking moth. You can see it's sort of beautiful, beautiful colours. The picture there on the right is a root hanging down in a culvert, and all these heralds are sort of all clinging to the root and to each other. It's just an extraordinary sight, and I see this every year, and it's still exciting. It still makes me happy every time. So the hibernating herald project wasn't actually started with heralds in mind. It started with this moth on the right there, which is a tissue. And this site here is my ruined castle in East Lothian. And I found myself here in November 2016. And I was actually I'd heard that someone had seen some heralds in here. And back then I'd never seen a herald moth before. And I'd been out and about trying to find it in a different place, because I always like to find my own records, but I couldn't find any. So I'd gone to this castle just to see somebody else's heralds, and I did. And there were 70, I think, in this castle, which at the time was the highest number of heralds in one place in Scotland, recorded in Scotland. So that was nice. And then as I was sorting out my shoelaces, I noticed another moth on the wall low down by my elbow, and it was this tissue. And this is, in Scotland, a very rare moth, very few records, certainly not every year, scattered across Scotland and sort of generally believed to be a stray. It also overwinters as an adult. And so finding one overwintering in a castle sort of is suggestive of perhaps its resident here after all, which would be interesting. So Mark Hubert, again, came over the following weekend to twitch my tissue. And then we went to some mines near where he lived in West Lothian and found more. And we were quite excited. And we wanted to know where else this moth might be. Perhaps actually it is really quite common, established in South Scotland at least. And of course, the best way to check lots of sites quickly is to get lots of people to do it for you. And this was really what the motivation behind the Hibernating Herald project was. It was to get people from across Scotland to go and check out their local dark places to see what they could find. We were hoping that we might get lots of tissue records, but because tissue is quite a rare, or very likely to be a very rare moth, quite hard to spot as well. Whereas heralds are quite brightly coloured, widespread, much more likely to come across those. So we were, it was heralds that became the focus of this. I suppose it's essentially a citizen science type project. And lots of people have taken part over the last 8 years or so, not just seasoned moth recorders, but friends and family, random passers-by who've wondered what on earth I'm doing in a tunnel. And it's been, they're really good moths to show to people who aren't particularly interested in that kind of thing normally. They're beautiful. They just sit on the wall still. You can have a good look at them, and they're reasonably widespread. And in the process, we've been learning quite a lot about the herald moths. There's another picture of Mark with his head in a hole and me in a muddy tunnel. So for us, part of the joy of this Hibernating Herald project has been exploring these sites trying to find new holes in grounds and things like that. And I'm still finding them even 8 years later. So we found out lots of sort of interesting things about the ecology of heralds and tissue, actually. But perhaps one of the sort of standout results is about the numbers. So if you look in the National Moth Recording Scheme for Scotland, number of heralds in that 3-year period, 2017 to 2020, 329 heralds recorded out of hibernation. So that's light traps and sugaring and caterpillars and things like that. And compared that same time period, the hibernating herald survey, 10,950 heralds. So huge difference, completely different idea of how numerous this moth is. And of course, the other thing, if you're out sort of targeting one species and looking at lots of different sites and doing it every year, and seeing that many moths, of though that 10,000 is a few years old now. I've probably seen 12,000 heralds in the last 8 years. I've only found one aberration, which is this one here, which is rather pretty. We get a few which are sort of more yellow than orange, but other than that, they're remarkably similar with each other. In the middle there, you've got so some sites, some of the heralds get attacked by this fungus, and the pathogenic fungus, which is really, it's quite beautiful in a sort of macabre way. And we've had some of them sequenced. So it's a Saria farinosa. I don't know much about its ecology, the fungus, or its life cycle. I don't think anyone does. So I've got a whole load of these moths in my freezer with fungus. I'm wondering what I'm going to do with them, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to get some more information out of that. And last year I found my first heralds in a hollow tree, which is quite exciting. I don't know what my next sort of challenge is in terms of heralds, probably to find one in a badger set or a rabbit warren or something. Anyway, I think, although it's a common moth, although I see lots every year, there's still, each year I find something slightly different or slightly new that I haven't seen before. And of course, there's a whole load of other moths and other insects and slugs and all sorts of things that hang out in these dark places over winter and indeed at other times of year. So, my recommendation is do grab a torch and go and check out your local dark places and see what you can find. So just some things, peacock and small tortoiseshell butterflies, some micros there, which are quite unusual, coast diamondback, Rugnostis and Ulatella, just in a couple of coastal caves. The Acrolepia bittersweet moth was new to East Lothian last year in a pillbox. Old Lady, that's in my local culvert in North Berwick that goes underneath Aldi. Some years I've had 100 or nearly 100 in this culvert. So this doesn't overwinter. This is a moth to see in July and August. Just amazing. Again, the numbers, and they're all sort of overlapping each other. Really lovely. So do go and check out your local dark places. And then just to really finish with a few words about the tissue moth, which is what the Hibernating Herald project is sort of all about. Probably my favourite species, if I have to choose one. It is just beautiful. So this overwinters as an adult. They're quite, unlike the herald, they're quite variable in pattern. So you can, if you take photographs of them in particular, you can identify individuals. And so this slide here, the two opposite ones on the sort of yellowish background are actually the same moth. And this means, so in Scotland, we don't see very many tissue, usually only one, perhaps 2, 3 in a site. But you can tell if you go to the same place every month, for example, you can tell if the moths that you're seeing are the same ones or different ones. And this means we get a much more accurate idea of numbers. So although we're only ever seeing 1 or 2 at a time, some years we've managed to find quite a lot. And this is my only graph, shows the number of tissue that we've seen in Scotland over the years. The purple is the number. So in 2018, which was the mega year, over 120 individual tissues, probably no more than, I think, 10 or something was the most seen at any one time. So that just goes to show the sort of the different view again you get of being able to identify individual moths. And the darker coloured bar there is the number of sites that these have been in. And as you can see, in recent years, there's been a massive drop in numbers. So we still find them every year in the same sort of set of sites, but it's nothing like it was in 2017, 2018. And you can only imagine how the whole project might have evolved if that first tissue had been found in 2021 or something. With such low numbers, maybe we wouldn't have been motivated to continue. So I keep hoping that there'll be an uptick, and we'll start to find more again up here in Scotland. However, luckily, I've got friends in Yorkshire, and you have lots of tissue in the Dales in particular. I think the Yorkshire Dales must be the tissue headquarters of the UK, and some of you will recognise some of these people. So there's Nairi and David Fernley and Paul Millard, who have been monitoring tissue in the caves in sort of the Wharfdale area in particular for many years, for longer than I've been looking for tissue in Scotland. And through the tissue, we've made friends, and I've been down to see their tissue a few times, and it is just extraordinary. So in some sites and some years, there's hundreds of tissue in a cave. You don't get quite as many heralds, but the tissue are just everywhere. It's almost heaven. So that's really nice. And because you've got so many in your cave, you can't follow them individually in the same way that we do in Scotland. And I think that sort of also illustrates, you think you get to know a moth, you think you know a moth by, I think I might know tissue by following them in Scotland, but actually go to a different place where they're much more numerous, much more rare, or might feed on a different food plant or something. And there's differences in their ecology and things, subtle differences. So, another nice thing about moths is you can never ever know them properly, really. And so I think I wanted really to finish. So I've talked about the beautiful moths, of course, which is a great motivation for mothing for me. The beautiful places that it takes you, the sort of learning about plants and food plants and the botanical knowledge that I've learned, but then also the lovely people that I've met in my mothing journey adventures. And the mothing community, the natural history community actually in the UK is a wonderful thing to be part of. And on that note, I want to give a shout out to Mark Hubert, who is my county moth recorder. He's the county moth recorder of all the Lothian counties, 5 counties now. And we're not sure whether we're good for each other or bad for each other, but we certainly egg each other on sort of slightly crazy mothing expeditions. So this was last year, scaling Mid-Lothian's highest peak, which isn't really a mountain, but in search of northern dart. We didn't find it. The weather went foul and maybe we didn't got any moths, but we lugged all our traps and our batteries and our tents, feather pillow, up to a feather pillow, food. I think Mark's still recovering, his shoulder's still recovering from the trip, but it was enormous fun. And him and Roy have written this brilliant book, Larger Moths of Scotland, which I recommend to anyone. It's relevant to any moth recorder or anyone interested in natural history, actually, in the UK. Lots of lovely information about our moths and sort of information that you don't find in normal field guides. And then I'm told I have to do plugging myself as well. So just to finish, I've also written a book, Meetings with Moths, which is similar to this talk, things I've got up to around Scotland looking for moths. And another project that I've done, which I haven't talked about at all this evening, where I have been following in the footsteps of a lady who lived in East Lothian 100 years ago and recorded moths. Project's on hold because I've got too much other work to do, but I haven't finished it. But I wrote a blog for a few years, and you can find that online, Whittingham Moths. And on the back of that project, last year for Insect Week, I met up with a museum entomologist, curator, a young artist, a historian of science from America, and we chatted about women in entomology and Alice Balfour. And there's a recording on the Butterfly Conservation YouTube site. And that is me, I think.